Hello, everybody. It's time for our 3 o'clock press conference. We have a press availability from 3 until 3:30 with Simon Winchester, who is a journalist and book author. His most recent book is Atlantic, Great Sea Battles, Heroic Discoveries, Titanic Storms, and a Vast Ocean of a Million Stories. Other books that he has written include The Professor and the Madman, A Tale of Murder, Insanity, and the Making of the Oxford English Dictionary, and The Map That Changed the World, William Smith and the Birth of Modern Geology. Mr. Winchester gave AGU's Presidential Forum lecture today at lunchtime, and he's here available to say a few things and answer your questions.
Yes, I have nothing to say other than I'll answer any questions that are put to me, but I came over here to give the talk at lunchtime, and I thought it was going to go. There's been quite a lot of hostility here because of a piece I wrote in Newsweek last March about the earthquake in Japan, but none of that surfaced today at the talk, so I was delighted that I had a relatively peaceful reception. Anyway, I'm here with no particular agenda. On the other hand, if anyone wants to ask any questions, I'd be more than happy to try and answer them. And if no one does want any questions, then I'm going to go and have my lunch. Ah, there's a question. Damn.
Not having attended your talk, I would like to know what you said in brief outline.
Yes, well, I can give it to you in 1 hour and 5 minutes, if you like.
The 5-minute version will do.
I decided that I could either talk about the controversy, about science writing, about the whole business of communicating scientific information to the public, or I could talk about the Atlantic Ocean, which is the subject of my recent book. And it seemed to me that as the Atlantic was one of the greatest geophysical constructs on this planet, and that part of the new rationale under the new president of the AGU is to look at the involvement of society with geophysics, that this would be a nice match. And so I basically talked about the Atlantic Ocean and its importance, not merely as a piece of interesting geology, but also as how it's figured in human history. So it was about how the Atlantic is the most important ocean in the world. It's not the biggest, but it is, in my view, the most important. So that was the piece. And then when I finished the talk, I said, now questions, but before I actually invite any questions, let me just tell you that I wrote this piece in Newsweek last March, and I told people how it was written and acknowledged that there was a bit of hasty or sloppy writing in the last but one paragraph, and that had excited a lot of angry comment from a lot of people, and that I apologized for it and said, but that's part of the nature of hurried journalism. I had to write the piece in, I think, 40 minutes, and it had a much greater effect than I imagined. And so it lit up the Twitter sphere like you wouldn't believe. And for a while I was a pariah, but I have broad shoulders and I'm used to being criticized. So, but anyway, I addressed it today and offered my mea culpas, and no one threw anything at me, so I've survived, in other words, so it's a good thing.
So you kind of talked about some of your failures today, which as science writers, I think all of us can appreciate that we've done some things that have been successful and some that have not. And you talked about your book about the Midwest, and also that you wrote a book about the Pacific that didn't do well. And
yes.
All of us on the Pacific Rim would consider the Pacific to be the most important ocean, at least for the future. So I'm just wondering why, did you just feel less passionate about it, or why do you think the book about the Pacific did fail?
No, I felt enormously passionate about it. I was living in Hong Kong at the time, and everyone told me the Pacific is the ocean of the future, and that I should write a book about it, much as you say today. It's not merely geologically interesting, it's commercially interesting. But the trouble was, at least with the way I chose to write the book, it turns out that it's not an ocean with a very long human history. That you have the Polynesian navigators, you have Magellan, you have Captain Cook, you have the Battle of Midway. But compared to the Mediterranean and compared to the Atlantic, It's the human involvement with the ocean is relatively minimal. And so I think that was the problem, the commercial problem with the book, that it's a big and beautiful ocean, but it's not a very interesting one so far as humankind is concerned. Whereas the Atlantic is not so big and not so beautiful, but has an absolutely fascinating human history, you know, flight and radios and container ships and battles of Trafalgar and Jutland and so much, piracy, the Middle Passage, slavery. It just goes on and on and on. It's an Atlantic, the ocean is full of very good stories. The Pacific is not.
Christina Reed, Discovery News. And so you talked in your talk about the Skeleton Coast and the story there and how that inspired you to start writing the Atlantic. And I was wondering, I know when I do research for stories, I tend to over-research a story, and then it's a matter of trying to figure out how much to put in and how much to leave out. So when you have such a beautiful story to tell, what are your tricks for making it cleaner, faster, cutting out things that are sometimes quite dear?
Well, I think I spent 30 years or so of my life as a newspaper correspondent. And when you work for a newspaper, as many of you will know, you have a deadline and you have a length. You've got to write to length and you've got to write to time. So it teaches you not to be over flowery in your language, and it teaches you economy in use of words. And I think that skill, if you can call it that, translates when you write a book. I mean, I have a very perhaps unusual way of writing books. I have a counter on my screen in which I say, I've got 150,000 words to write. That's the contract for this book. And I've got 150 days, let us say, to write it, because it's due on, let us say, the 31st of July. So each day I see how many words I've written, how many days I've got left, the number of words per day that I'm writing, the number of words per day that I will need to write in order to make the target. And I adhere to it very faithfully, so that on day 150 I will have, by hook or by crook, 150,000 words. And a friend of mine has just written a big book on the Titanic, because of course in April it's going to be the centenary of the sinking. He was asked for 125,000 words and he delivered 250,000 words. And so he's become a complete nightmare to his editor. And inevitably, if you leave the editor to take out the boring bits, an awful lot will be on the cutting room floor, which shouldn't be. It's up to the writer to, in my view anyway, to determine what goes and what stays. And sometimes it means it's a hard decision, but if you make it yourself, it'll be a better decision than someone else doing it, I think.
So another craft of writing question. I'm Stephanie from LiveScience. Back to the hostility issue. Given there is a risk of earthquake in British Columbia, and I think you were trying to highlight that, kind of given more time, how would you have written or what would you have said to get that across?
I think I probably would have said much the same, I think. But I would have inserted caveats and said, it's my somewhat eccentric belief that, based on little information. But I want to get it across to people. I mean, this whole business of earthquake triggering is a very complex field. I mean, that's something that I know now that I didn't know a year ago. And there are a lot of people who believe that earthquakes, big earthquakes, do trigger smaller earthquakes. And that the analogy of the world, the planet, being like a big brass bell, and you hit it with an enormous hammer, and it vibrates, and in its points of weakness, which are often plate boundaries, other sympathetic earthquakes will occur. A sizable number of people believe that to be the case. However, there are others, notably statisticians, who say if you look at every magnitude 7 earthquake since 1900 that is on record, there is no statistical evidence that one links to another. On the other hand, events occur like Sumatra 2004, where another very big earthquake occurs within a year, very close to the original earthquake. So the whole picture is confusing, and my analogy continues to stand up. But what I should have done, had I thought it through much more carefully, but my excuse is simply I didn't have enough time to, is that I would have continued with the thought, but I would have inserted a few maybes or something or some sort of softening. So I remain true to the belief, but I would have been more prudent in the way I put it.
Hi, Irene Klotz with Reuters and Discovery News. Are you working on another book?
Yes. I'm doing a book about America because I've just become a citizen. So I wanted to write a book which is a sort of... I mean, I'm very fond of this country and I believe in it, and I'm very much a Jeffersonian Democrat and think that this is still... I also believe in American exceptionalism, even though I appreciate that that's gone out of vogue. So I wanted to come up with a scheme to write a book in which I could display my enthusiasm for this country, not in a cheesy way, but in a sort of well thought out way. And so what I decided to do was to say, all right, I've become a citizen of this country. What exactly have I bought into here? Is it the United States? And to look with that question in mind at a number of people, famous people, who worked on uniting the country in one way or another, beginning with Lewis and Clark, looking at the 4 big geological surveys, including the one that particularly attracts me as Clarence King in the 1860s, the building of the Transcontinental Railway, the building of the telegraph system, the building of the canals that linked the Great Lakes to the Gulf, and 1 or 2 other things, and the building of the interstate highway system. So I've spent this year shuttling back and forth between essentially New York, where I live, and San Francisco, by a variety of means of transport. I mean, I was here 3 months ago, having driven here along the route that the young Captain Eisenhower drove in 1919 when he was essentially surveying the state of the roads in America in 1919. And I've just come over, as I mentioned in my talk, by train. And I'm doing the canal trip from Chicago to St. Louis through what's called the rather unbeautifully named the Chicago Sanitary Canal, which was built in the early 1900s. And I'll be doing that later this month. I thought the canals froze up. They may, but the particular barge company that I'm going with has got a big, very powerful ice-breaking barge. And once I've done those, then I'll begin the writing at the end of the year and deliver it using the fascist technique that I use by the 31st of July, and it'll be published in 2013. And the proposed title is The Men Who United the States, which seems an obvious title. I'm surprised it's not been used. So anyway, The Men Who United the States, with any luck, will come out in 2013. Excellent. Free to go. Thank you very much indeed. Good, super.